We want no security problems with China. It's got to be an American company.
The thing that doesn't make sense is this idea that by selling TikTok to a U.S. company, the U.S. then mitigates the so-called China danger.
We're not going to do business with Huawei.
One problem is that blocking China from buying American tech increases the trade deficit and increases Chinese self-sufficiency. The circumstances are really quite incredible, and not just because Donald Trump basically wants to appropriate partly a foreign company, effectively nationalizing a foreign industry, which is really hard to believe given longstanding U.S. values against such behavior. It's especially incredible because what we have here is a globally popular app for kids, essentially, and while adults and marketers have paid a lot of attention and maybe even been fans, TikTok's content is meme-oriented and really comes out of the Guichu form that was developed and popularized among Chinese youth by Chinese providers like Bilibili. Now, there's no questioning the success of the app or its generational appeal across cultures, and it really indicates a type of global convergence of culture, especially among young people. That said, a lot of these apps are fads. They rise and fall like pop stars within a few years as the culture shifts and the next generation seeks to distinguish itself with its own commodity fetish-focused identity. So while we should conclude that all this concern and posturing over TikTok is ridiculous and grossly unfair to the company, we might also think that it's doubly ridiculous because TikTok's lifespan was probably limited anyway. That said, I suspect the respective US and Chinese bans are both more concerned about who gets access to TikTok's American and Chinese user data, which is probably the most sensitive and durable thing of value the company has. The thing that doesn't make sense is this idea that by selling TikTok to a US company, the US then mitigates the so-called China danger. If that's the case, then why can't Huawei sell its products to US companies? Now, I know that some might say the key difference comes down to hardware versus software, but the primary concern raised against Huawei is software. So if a Chinese black box threat for hacking and spying and malicious code is so real, which is what the US alleges against Huawei, then does American ownership of TikTok's Chinese code effectively resolve Trump's concerns about TikTok? And if so, then does it all come down to who owns the code and controls updates and holds the data? And if that's the case, then should we pretend these TikTok problems, however real or imagined, will dissipate with responsible American ownership, as though American companies don't exploit or mishandle data, don't get hacked or bought by foreign influences, and don't get used for spying by the US government or others? And if an American company buys TikTok, would it then be allowed, given the Trump administration, to sell that to, say, a European company or a Russian one? Ultimately, the worst case scenario is that China blocks the app sale, the app ban is upheld in the US and elsewhere with no legal relief, and the company either folds or continues in a smaller form until it becomes culturally passé or reemerges as a new product. Beijing's new moves, including the export ban, are powerful responses that have caught some observers by surprise. It's clear that the Chinese side, both enterprises and the government, have been moving quickly in recent years to build local capacity and remove critical supply chain choke points. The outstanding weakness here remains semiconductors and chip manufacturing. But I suspect the Chinese side is better prepared for this than reports indicate. And anyway, it continues to buy chips from the US, as well as less hostile places, including South Korea and even Taiwan. Ironically, one problem, of course, is that blocking China from buying American tech increases the trade deficit and increases Chinese self-sufficiency. And I think this is where Beijing has had the hardest time understanding the US. Because it's so self-destructive, it's hard to believe the US is willingly doing this to itself. And I think this is where the tit for tat stops on the Chinese side. On the one hand, why punish American companies like Apple for producing in China? Why block their sales? This would only harm Chinese consumers and workers and negatively impact Chinese tax revenues, as well as feed negative views on China around the world. And Huawei certainly isn't hurting for device sales in the Chinese market. Rather, it appears to be thriving in part because of the competition and even because of Trump's economic nationalism. On the other hand, where Beijing has or had security concerns, it has already put its own blocks in place. For example, Google, Facebook, and this new export ban, and so on. Similarly, we can look at how some American firms have adjusted in stride, again, like Apple, which is now storing its Chinese user data on Chinese servers, or segregating apps in different national app stores. Ultimately, I think it's reasonable to assume that Beijing will act reasonably and therefore is unlikely to impose gratuitous bans that run contrary to China's actual economic interest and that serve no security value. The way Washington announces attacks on Huawei or TikTok, alleged spying or consulate closures, indicates above all that it wants a drip-drip approach that plays well in American media, particularly during the ongoing presidential campaign, where Trump has heralded his tough stance on China as one of the key reasons to re-elect him. It's clear that there's a schedule, a game plan, with key players coordinating their messages to hit media cycles and reinforce each other, including Vice President Pence, Secretary Pompeo, the Director of National Intelligence, the FBI Director, and of course Trump himself. So Trump wants to drag this out, a death by 1,000 cuts, because he gets more political benefit from doing so. If he was really concerned about national security and not just his own job security, then he could act a lot more aggressively. Just ban real or potential problems once and for all. Everything could be done quickly. However, Trump also knows that acting too quickly would destabilize U.S. markets and lead to shortages in critical goods. Yesterday, I was in a grocery store parking lot and saw a piece of garbage on the ground, a little Chinese certificate of quality for face mask. It even had the little Chinese seal with the red star in the middle, Chinese writing. So it's a certificate of quality for face masks that someone had dropped while masking up to go inside to buy groceries. And symbolically, I think it's a remarkable piece of litter. Furthermore, I just ordered a new Apple computer needed for my daughter's online schooling because she can't go to school because of the uncontrolled COVID outbreak here. And I had to order it through an Apple website because all of their stores are still shut down due to the outbreak. And then I had to track its shipment from China to Korea to my home. In fact, whether online or in shops, still an astronomically high number of low, high, and no-tech products Americans buy come from China. That reality won't change quickly, despite what Trump says or wants. Indeed, there's been no real reshoring of manufacturing jobs in the U.S., despite that being a signature objective of his first campaign. Instead, tens of millions have lost their job due to America's inability to deal effectively with COVID-19.